Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you. I'm Gary Hilderbrand, the Hornbeck Professor in Practice and the Chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture here at GSD, and it's a great honor for me tonight to welcome our speaker, the one and only Lauret Savoy, for her talk entitled Trace, Memory, History, Race, and the American Landscape. Your topic could not be more central to what we aspire to in unearthing narratives and telling truths about our landscape wherever we work. And speaking of truths, I'll begin by acknowledging that the Harvard Graduate School of Design is located on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what we now know as Cambridge and Boston. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past, present, and future, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to them. The school also recognizes the work of the Harvard University Native American program in cultivating the relationships that led to this acknowledgement. A quick reminder that we have live captioning tonight for our virtual audience. To enable the captions, click the closed captioning button at the bottom of the live screen window. Shout out of thanks to Raquel, to Han, Matt, and Brian, and the entire events staff at GSD, and Paige for organizing this, the good work that they all do to make our events successful here. I also would like to invite you for some upcoming events. This is a very busy time at the GSD and everywhere else. Tomorrow, the architect, curator, and author Pedro Godano will feature a lecture in the Francis Loeb Library lobby at noon. And also, this Thursday, March 28th, Mario Carpo will present his John Heddick Soundings lecture entitled, ready for this, Generative AI, Imitation, Style, and the eternal return of precedent. That's a tongue twister. Here in Piper Auditorium on Thursday. And now for this evening's event. It's a special honor to introduce our speaker in the context of joint sponsorship, something that I hope we'll be doing more of. For this event, GSD has partnered with Harvard's Marinda Humanities Center. We're grateful to have Dean Robin Kelsey here. And we're also pleased to have Tiya Miles here tonight, very pleased. And we've asked Tiya to introduce Lauret's talk. So Tiya is the Michael Garvey Professor of History and a Radcliffe Alumni Professor at Harvard University. She's the author of a lot of books, 7 books, including 4 prize-winning histories of American slavery. Her most recent works include the National Book Award winner, All That She Carried, which is an absolutely incredible book. The Journey of Ashley Sack. Such a great book, a Black family keepsake. And recently, Wild Girls, How the Outdoors Shaped the Women Who Challenged a Nation. These are such important topics. Tiya was a 2011 MacArthur Prize Fellow and a 2017 Mellon Fellow. These are just a few of the remarkable accolades she brings with her. So let me thank you, Tiya, for helping us to give a proper welcome tonight to Lauret. Thank you.
Hello, you all. Hey, Lauret. It's so nice to see you. It's wonderful that you came out. It's chilly out there, more than chilly. It's drizzly. It's misty. I was thinking about Lauret driving across the state in this weather. So glad you made it safely. You know, I think this is really interesting, and to me it's inspiring that when I came in and saw Lauret, she started talking about poets and the way they breathe, and she was saying that she loves to watch poets in person, in real space and in real time, so that she can watch the way they're taking in breath and releasing breath. And we were talking about how that feels like what the weather's doing out there, breathing. In her inspired research and poetic writing, Professor Lauret Savoy considers how American history has marked the land and people, and also how the forms of the land shape personal and social experience. Dr. Savoy writes about the complex interconnections of natural and cultural histories, as well as her African American, Euro-American, and indigenous heritages, to understand the origins of the lands that we now call the United States, and the stories we tell about ourselves in and on these grounds and waterways. Her most recent book, Trace, Memory, History, Race, and the American Landscape, won the 2016 American Book Award and was a finalist for a PEN Literary Prize, as well as others. Additionally, she has co-edited a foundational collection called The Colors of Nature, Culture, Identity, and the Natural World. I have a beaten up old paperback copy in my office that I refer to often. She also co-edited Bedrock, Writers on the Wonders of Geology, which was named one of the 5 best science books of the year by the Wall Street Journal. Her essays have appeared in Orion Magazine, Travel and Leisure, Art Forum, the Christian Science Monitor, and many other venues. Dr. Savoy is the David B. Truman Professor of Environmental Studies and Geology at Mount Holyoke College. I should get that right because I have a daughter who's going to school there. We love Mount Holyoke. Yes, absolutely. She has received Mount Holyoke's Distinguished Teaching Award, fellowships from the Andrew Carnegie Foundation, the Smithsonian Institution, Yale University, and soon the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History here at Harvard. Lauret Savoy's breathtaking work, in her own words, quote, draws from her need to put the eroded world into language, to remember fragmented past into present. The work is as necessary as breath, she writes. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Lauret Savoy.
Thank you, dear Tiya, and thank you, Gary, and good evening to you and everyone here. I'm honored, truly honored to be with you. I need to give deep thanks, first to the Graduate School of Design, to the Environment Forum at the Mahindra Humanities Center, and to the Salada Institute for Climate and Sustainability for hosting me and making this evening possible. So thank you to you all. The goals and works of the co-sponsors matter a great deal. The GSD notes that many of the public lectures this spring offer interdisciplinary perspectives on history, memory, and the natural world. The Environment Forum notes that it is, and these are its words, is dedicated to exploring new work in the arts and humanities that reframes or reimagines the relationship of humanity to the rest of nature. And the Salada Institute emphasizes that, and these are their words, the solutions are all around us. The Institute is a fulcrum for collaboration. Yes, to all. And can you imagine the work in collaboration of all these entities? I'm also deeply grateful to several people, and I hope it's all right if I name a few here. First, to Tiya, who held out a hand when it was most needed, and whose work has nourished my spirit. And to Gary Hilderbrand, thank you for welcoming me. And to Robin Kelsey, thank you. and to Raquel Rivera, to Ken Stewart, to Sarah Whiting, to Tina O'Brien, to Matt Smith and Brian McCardle, to Han Cho, I hope I said it correctly, and to Heather Hansen. And of course, I have to give very special thanks to Paige Johnston, who first invited me 3 years ago on behalf of Michael Hayes, a time when horrendous injuries made even virtual presentations nearly impossible. It wasn't possible then, but Paige gently asked and checked in again and again over 3 years until we were finally able to make this evening possible. So thank you, Paige. Thank you for your tenacity and best wishes in your new position. And I have to give a shout out to someone who's listening live stream. Hello, Garnet. I hope you're enjoying Columbia. And of course, I give thanks to everyone who made this evening possible, and to all of you for welcoming me. So let me begin by saying that every talk or reading that I give, for me, is a journey of discovery because of the people I meet and the dialogues we engage in. So I look forward to conversation afterwards. But before I begin, I do need to pay respect to the land that I stand on and to the people for whom this is traditional and ancestral homeland, the Massachusetts people, past, present, and future. And I also need to pay respect to origins. I come from a family that was silent and silenced in many ways. And one of the most recent ways is this. It wasn't until years after my father's death that I learned that he was a writer whose novel on racial hatred and passing, titled Alien Land, was published to some fanfare by the big New York press, E.P. Dutton. But Dutton canceled his contract on reading a draft of the second would-be novel about a Negro artist fighting segregation in the nation's capital and exploring the possibility of communism. My father found himself blacklisted, and I don't know if he ever knew the reason why. I only know this because I got his FBI file. And when I came along much later in his life, this bitter, angry man did not write and often did not speak. Silence was easy for me to learn. And I've often wondered how much the deep, unspoken hunger or need of a parent can touch a child, even marking a path for her to follow. So now I'd like to take you down this path with me. I'll begin with a few words on the book Trace, Memory, History, Race, and the American Landscape. And then I'd like to speak about a work in progress, a deepening of questions on the marks of history and geology in our lives and on this land. This writing began in a struggle to answer or at least come to terms with questions that haunted me since childhood. Questions about identity and origins, about what it means to inhabit this land and to be a citizen of this nation. Questions about what my relationship with history and place really is. The struggle became a mosaic of journeys and historical inquiry that crossed a continent in time to consider how this country's ever-unfolding history has marked the land, marked this society, and marked me as a person. So the journeys took me from the north rim of the Grand Canyon and the twisted terrain within the San Andreas Fault zone, including a place called the Devil's Punch Bowl. From there to a South Carolina plantation. From an island in Lake Superior to Indian countries and black towns in Oklahoma. From national parks to burial grounds, through an alien land and a land ethic, to the names this land wears and the origins of these names. And from the U.S. Mexico border to the U.S. Capitol and the origins of both. In all, Trace counters some of our oldest and most damaging public silences. None of them is coincidental. Too few of them appear in public history. Yet they all touch us. So when I ask first-year students at Mount Holyoke what history is, one common response is that it's the things or events that happened in the past, right? And to that right, I just smile. And then students soon realize that it's also what is said to have happened. That is, the narratives that have been created to recount what supposedly matters in scholarship and textbooks, in museums, at memorials and monuments, at historical sites and ruins, in the names of places as well as the names of species, in rituals, ceremonies, performances. The list goes on and on. Students also see that what matters is far from simple or innocent or universal. And they see that the past is far from finished or gone. It's present around and within us. Historical memory of some elements of the past has required the repressing, silencing, eroding, or omitting of counter-elements by those holding the power to define public memory and the archival record across time, across all the successive moments from back then to now. The power to segregate public memory and public history in narratives and the power to segregate people have always worked in concert. Like an old plantation cemetery, tended even today, and gated, marked, with marble headstones as ornately carved as the public stories that are still told about the owners 2 centuries ago. Yet there are no public records or public memory of those lying beneath fist-size stones, scattered like stepping stones in the brambles and weeds and deadfall beyond. Stones over those who were once enslaved. Trace considers how we all make our lives among relics and ruins of former times and former worlds. Sand and stone are pieces of Earth's memory, yet each of us is also a terrain inscribed by memory and by loss. The past we emerge from is broken and pitted by gaps not entirely unlike the fragmented annals of Earth history. For me, with ancestral roots not only in Africa, but in other world regions too, these gaps grew from many things. From silences stretched across generations, from losses of language and voice, from dispossession, diasporas, and forced servitude, from complex dimensions, multitude dimensions of lives that were flattened under the weight of ignorance and stereotype. And also from public narratives that still dismember who we, the people, are to each other and to the land. So, I ask each of you here, please, to think about your own lives, the lives of your families, your ancestors, as best you can, and ask yourself 3 questions. 1, if each of our lives is a single instant, like a camera shutter that opens and closes, what can we make of ourselves, of our lives, of our place in the world for that single instant we have? 2, over time and over space, what do generations of instants mean? And then 3, finally, please ask yourself, what is my relationship with history, told and untold, on this land, of this land? Our answers will differ, our stories will differ, and it's the richness of experience that matters, and the sharing of that richness that is vital. What is your trace? What can you trace? Now I'd like to share some words on a new, that's perfect timing actually, on a new and current project that tries to answer the latter of these 2 questions in a place that is one of the crucibles of this nation's identity, a place of pivotal convergences in the Atlantic world, and a place of paradox. Geology and history engage in dialogue together with landscapes and what it means to live with the land. Now, first, though, I want to give a word on what I mean by landscape. And I consider it in the broad sense noted here by landscape architect Anne Whiston Spurn, whom I know many of you here know. What is important to me is the association of place and people, inhabiting place, working in place, living on it, with it, from it. What's also important are the reciprocal senses of shaping the land, and the experience on the land, shaping people. And what's also important is to consider that associations need not be beneficial or benign. They can be violent, they can be damaging, they can be filled with hate. And all of these elements come to bear in this study. So I ask you to please keep these threads in mind as I continue. I should also add that this next step in my journey away and beyond trace began with many things. Of course, trying to understand origins of generations, but also trying to answer a child's question in wondering. She wondered at the age of 8 if it was possible to imagine and hold eternity. So imagine the last breath before dawn, a moment of undefined edges slipping between dark and night, when it seems one might step through time and space merged. From the crest of Virginia's Blue Ridge, I look over what at the close of night appears to be a vast, wind-silenced sea, fog-bound, mist-covered. Soon, slant light details land contouring beneath diffusing vapor, contours bound only by the dawn horizon. These lithic swells of the Piedmont, the foot of the mountains, extend eastward toward the Tidewater coastal plain, toward Chesapeake Bay, toward the Atlantic Ocean beyond. The first time I stood at such an overlook in Shenandoah National Park, a child of 8 or 9 beholding mist becoming earth, I thought eternity resided here, an existence that had to exceed human breath and human hatred. In later years, I learned other scales of time and the ticks by which it is measured. The outcrop that gives me footing is such a timepiece. Contoured nice, cold to the touch, its grains and fabric expose a small window to Earth's past. Ancient roots of mountains that formed kilometers underground now lie high on the Blue Ridge. They offer a deep interior view befitting H.G. Wells or Jules Verne. What I see in these rocks is a composite of violence and catastrophe that extended over 1 billion years, a testament to Earth's abiding tectonic movements, long vanished ocean basins that preceded the Atlantic Ocean, opening, then closing. Mountain ranges that preceded these Appalachians, rising newborn when island arcs, pieces of continents, and other land masses converged, caught in the tightening vise of closing ocean basins. They collided, they squeezed, and smeared against each other and uplifted. Thick earth tiles crushed and imbricated to make mountains, and mountains that sutured collision seams at edges then stood within newly assembled supercontinents as monuments to obliterated seas. The Appalachian Mountains formed in the most recent convergence that made Pangaea all Earth nearly 300 million years ago, or so geologists say. Later, as dinosaurs roamed about, Pangaea began to rift. And here, in the Atlantic Ocean's birth, re-jigsawed continents diverged in the wake. Ranges that were sibling to the Appalachians now stand estranged across the Atlantic in the Caledonides of Ireland, Scotland, Scandinavia. They have kin in bedrock across Western and Central Europe, in Africa's Mauritανide belt, and the Atlantic Ocean continues to widen. Its margins, its trailing edges continue to move apart. And for hundreds of millions of years, Appalachian peaks, once as lofty as the Andes, have yielded to relentless weathering and erosion. And this, too, is geological insistence. Residues of decay carried downward to spread around their bases like a falling skirt toward the Atlantic, toward the interior. And these mountains, though long worn down, still form the backbone of eastern North America. That they endure is why I return. Now, one could say that Africa and Europe were here before, cheek by jowl with North America. But then again, they weren't. The continents known by these names have existed largely in their present outlines for tens of millions of years, their most ancient cores for billions. But names and notions of these places have followed different, more recent paths. Africa might conjure more or other than a large continent south of Europe in which hominids evolved. Europe might be taken to mean other than simply the landmass north of Africa. Vestiges of repeated geologic collision, rupture, and erosion fill this broad Chesapeake landscape, this broad Appalachian terrain. Yet human forms of collision, rupture, and erosion occurred here as well, and they still do. Looming as heavy shadows are traces of a history foundational to the United States and to what the nation would become, traces that still mark this country today. To Powhatan, Piscataway, Rappahannock, Appomattox, Pamunkey, and other tribal societies, this was and is homeland. For the Joint Stock Virginia Company, which established Jamestown in 1607, this land was an imagined source of fortune, profit. The brutal mischief of early commodity experiments bound geological and cultural collisions to the work of chance. Tidewater river sands, glittering with flecks of mica and grains of pyrite eroded from Appalachian highlands, teased many a mercenary eye, until metal assays in England dashed dreams of gold. Then, having chanced upon soil and climate suitable to certain strains of tobacco, adventurers began to tap its marketability. Captives from Africa, from the Americas and Caribbean, from elsewhere in the world would power its cultivation as the key export staple, grounding an empire upon smoke. The first plantation revolution on mainland North America began here as the drive for tobacco wealth established slavery on a massive scale and transformed landscapes wholesale. And through it all, indigenous nations found their ranks splintered and displaced from homeland after homeland, and some would find themselves enslaved by colonists. The title of this painting by Benjamin Latrobe is An Overseer Doing His Duty. So here in the Chesapeake, defining captives of primarily, but not only African descent as chattel, played out over at least 8 to 10 generations. And in new laws that made slavery lifelong and heritable, we can witness what historian Barbara Fields calls a society in the act of inventing race. By the time the United States held its first federal census in 1790, more than half of the new nation's nearly 700,000 enslaved souls lived and labored in Virginia and Maryland alone. The cotton boom of the Deep South was still in the future, still yet to come. Dispossession and captive bondage would occur again and again and again in the Chesapeake region as peoples from Africa, Europe, Indigenous America, and even the Indian Ocean basin converged by choice and by force in the 17th and 18th centuries. And so too would forms of connection and resistance. The color line was never sharp or fixed here, despite repeated laws. Neither was the edge between liberty and bondage. Not when English women could be effectively enslaved for a time because they chose to marry enslaved men. Not when many thousands of free people of color, free by law, tried to live on their own terms, some of them embodying complex, multi-continental heritage blendings. The legacy of the Chesapeake's colonial to antebellum worlds continue with us. Enduring yields include not only tobacco, but less recognized, less acknowledged terrains that shifted here too. Terrains of notions and assumptions, terrains of language and meanings, which collided and ruptured at different moments across centuries. It's important to remember that peoples from different world regions beyond Africa and Indigenous America would also be enslaved here. And that both language and assumptions of race would shift in this time, with different broad senses of terms over time, narrowing to the limited, more restrictive definitions and meanings that many people today think or believe have always existed as they are now, fixed and constant, but they didn't. Freedom and enslavement would define each other here unlike anywhere else in this nation. When Virginia seceded from the Union in 1861, it was the northernmost state fully invested in slavery and the largest slaveholding state. Yet almost as many free people of color lived in Virginia as in New York and New England combined. Only one state could claim more, Maryland, which had the most in the nation. So today, perhaps you've experienced it as I have, but motorists taking I-95 between Baltimore and Richmond might experience the route as one long traffic jam if driven on a Friday afternoon. But these two cities, just 130 miles apart as the crow flies, mark the contrast. Baltimore in Maryland became a port to freedom for many escaping enslavement. Richmond became the capital of the Confederacy. And between them stands Washington, D.C., a national capital carved from Maryland and Virginia at the desire of the first president and fellow Virginians, with the economic motives of a slave society in mind. Many people today know that the capital long condoned both chattel servitude and the trade of captive Africans within its borders. Some know that slave pens and markets stood within sight of the Capitol and White House, and that slavery would be abolished here only as the Civil War entered its second year in April of 1862. But few recognize that traces of slavery's landscape and architecture remain in plain sight for all to see if one can see. And this goes beyond the iconic structures like the Capitol and the White House, which were built largely or primarily by enslaved laborers. A case in point is the Maples. The Maples was a large plantation land on what is now called Capitol Hill to the east of the Capitol. The image on the upper left is the old manor house, abandoned at that point. Then the property was bought and renovated, rebuilt. The building to the left of the sign were the old quarters, the quote-unquote slave quarters, and other outbuildings that were part of the plantation. Now with this last image, the Maples, because they kept the name and call it a historic site, is a place of very expensive townhouses that I know I can't afford. And very few people know what the history of the Maples really was. And beyond that, too few realize that from day one, the Capitol also was a magnet for free people of color who would create a secret city within its borders. Secret because so much history has ignored it. Secret because their voices, their actions were not valued at that time by those in power. Yet their presence and the work they provided were key to the functioning of the capital city and the government before the Civil War. Most people don't know this. But what I've given you really is just impersonal history. And why does any of this matter? It matters for many reasons. Countless omissions and silences have led to incomplete senses of what the entwining of different peoples converging from different world areas in the Chesapeake landscape over time from the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s to the 20th century, what that has meant. Not only to the region, but to the nation. Omissions and silences that reflect what historian Annette Gordon-Reed calls the enforced anonymity of slavery, and I would add the tenuous shifting terrain or realm of not quite slavery, yet not citizenship for free people of color. Too much of this is lost from public history, such that evidence of lived experience is fragmentary at best, and for those of African, indigenous, and complex heritages is chiefly not in their voices or on their terms. But still, there are pieces, there are fragmented textures. My father's ancestral roots extend deep into Chesapeake earth, with his forebears converging here 3 centuries ago from Africa, from Europe, from Indigenous America, and, I've recently learned, from the Indian Ocean basin. These predecessors, who were free, indentured, enslaved, and enslaving, lived dispossession and forced diaspora. They lived free immigration and land grab. They all played different roles in the colonizing process, and they all were entangled within a fledgling society that was built on violence and bondage. And many were also part of an emerging population of free people of color of complex ancestries up to 2 centuries before the Civil War. And many moved to the capital city to live and function and serve that secret city that existed up through 1865. What's important to remember of this is that every single one of them, whatever their chosen identity or those wearing an identity imposed on them, had to negotiate the liminal spaces between free and not free, between white and other, and for some of them, depending on when they live, they would be defined in different ways, because states like Virginia and Maryland changed their laws defining who made a white person versus a quote-unquote mulatto. And what's also important is that all of them had to negotiate different relationships with the land. Relationships of choice, relationships of bondage, relationships of hope. Every place, every landscape is a site of memory and a site of oblivion and erasure. The Chesapeake is no exception. Its worlds of 1619, of 1730, of 1865 no longer exist, but they haunt our present. They are around and within us as ghosts. I am heir to tangible and intangible legacies that must be faced. And everyone in this nation is also heir to these legacies. No one is born onto a tabula rasa with no history. But how to recognize and honor their particular past in the land in a way that brings history home, that makes it more visceral and immediate than statistical, dry, or abstract. For me, recognizing the nature of and reasons behind silences and gaps is as important as gathering the pieces found. For during ancestors' lifetimes, nearly all of the paper records, the papered records, were made and kept by white property owners who largely controlled the land as well as social definitions and terms of engagement. Most accessible sources frame absence, whether in laws, in court cases, in deeds, in wills, in estate inventories, in day books, in account ledgers, whether in census records and tax lists, whether in free Negro registers. These documents were not made by the people who are being claimed within them. And so, not the least of what is lost is the internal, interior life. But there are outlines of exterior lives. Case in point is a free Negro register. This for Fenton Man, who was born free and appearing by the register of her mother, Clary Mann. Her color, tawny. She's 23 years of age. Her height is given. She's what number is that? 83? So she registered to verify that she was indeed born free, because the assumption was that if you were a person of color, the default was that you were enslaved unless you could prove otherwise. And so in this case, Fenton and Suki and all of these people in this register are claiming their freedom by the laws that restrict them. So a hard truth I navigate again and again is that no found fragment is innocent. No found fragment is unburdened. Finding pieces always means grasping a double-edged sword, such as with the degrading insults of these free Negro registers and identity papers, again, which had, as in this one from Margaret Lipscomb, had to be carried to prove one's free status. And both of these women, Margaret Lipscomb and Fenton Mann, are third great-grandmothers to me. And I would not have known of their presence, their existence, had I not found records such as this. So I take to heart these words by Tiya Miles. and these are Tiya's words, that we refuse to give up on those many people of the past who did not, could not, leave behind troves of documents, to abandon these individuals, they're archivally unknown, who fell through the cracks of class, race, and position, would consign them to a second death by permitting their erasure from history. It would also mean turning our faces away from fuller, if unwelcome, truths about our country and ourselves. Yes, yes. So my goal is to remember, to assemble a jigsaw of ancestral fragments and the many forms of absence encountered, to imagine what the remains and the gaps, the omissions, the distortions together imply. For even a partial sense could illuminate more complex contours of life, of race, and land, far beyond stereotype and generalization. So like Trace, this mosaic narrative of generations in this land considers how the past is remembered and told, how history is situated, it's placed, how history has a public function and responsibility, and how the past lives in the present, not just the present out there, but the present we carry within ourselves. And like Trace, the writing crosses boundaries of genre and discipline in the hope of giving breath and a different kind of breath. My other hope is that writing, through the lens of my search for a paternal family, will allow me to reveal more of the lingering, cutting marks of and ties between place and race in this nation today. So, question by life, we are always held to account. For me, remembering will help me honor shadowy traces of past lives. Remembering will also help me locate myself within many inheritances. As a descendant, as a Black woman of multiracial of heritage, as a geologist, as a writer, and as a citizen of this nation and of Earth. I hope you'll wish me luck. Thank you. So, if I may take a minute, here's a coda. On August 23rd, 2011, a few minutes before 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, an earthquake measuring 5.8 on the Richter scale shook the eastern half of North America, including here. Millions of people in more than 20 states and a few Canadian provinces, from Quebec to Florida, from the East Coast all the way to the mid-continent, Illinois and beyond, felt the ground lurch. It's been estimated that more people noticed and felt this earthquake than any other recorded in U.S. history. The epicenter lay in Virginia's Piedmont, and there unreinforced masonry took the brunt of damage as foundations shifted, walls cracked and spalled, and cities like the nation's capital and Richmond and Baltimore all felt it. The Washington Monument had to close for 3 years for repairs. Today, the East Coast does not lie near a plate boundary of convergence, not anymore. But earthquakes still occur here, reactivating old ruptures as this continent continues to adjust in its continuing tectonic dance. Sometimes called a passive margin by geologists, the trailing edge that is the East Coast belies passivity. Ancestral structures remain. in plain sight and out of view, but they still reach us all. Thank you. Do you like this one or this one? Okay.
Can you all hear me? This is on, right? Yes, all right. Well, Lauret, that was beautiful and so moving. The way you spoke it and the way you helped us to enter into your ideas and your words through movement. I expected a lot, but that was so much more than I was expecting, and I wish you could just keep going on and on and on.
Well, thank you, Tiya. And I have to say what I offered about the new work, this is the first time I've ever suggested it or spoke of it in public. And so you were the test case. And I need to think about it a bit more. And of course, it's a work in progress. But I hope that it made sense. In sense, I knew that would happen. Okay. Sense up here, but as well as heart sense, because this is heart work. Of course, it's intellectual work, but for me, I can't separate the two. They're all together for me.
Thank you for trusting us.
Thank you. Thanks.
So I am trying to watch the time on the back wall. I can't see all of it, but we have around, I think, 28 minutes for discussion. No one's telling me that's wrong, so I think that's about how much time we have left. And if it's all right with you and with you, I will ask you a couple of questions first, Lauret.
Please.
One question for each part of your talk, and then open it up to the audience's comments and thoughts. So you began with taking us back to Trace, your wonderful book, which if you haven't read it, I highly, highly, highly recommend it. It's beautiful. I see nods. Some people have already read it.
Thank you.
And since we're at the School of Design, I wondered if you could take us back to that image of the cemetery, the segregated cemetery, and talk with us about how, you don't have to do it actually, but just in terms of how you respond, talk with us about how the design or the layout of that cemetery or places like it reflect or undergird, strengthen, or disrupt these narratives of repression and omission that you talked about.
What you saw in that image was a photo taken around the cleared area where the owners are buried. And when I say owners, they established that plantation in the 1760s in South Carolina, not far from Spartanburg. And the public story that is told there is only about them and about their actions, their presence during the Revolutionary War. There is no word about, it was a 3,000-acre plantation, no word about the people who worked the land, even though it's called a resident farm in South Carolina teaching standards. It's a place where school kids go on school field trips to get a sense of history, but that history does not include more than information on resident workers, and that's the only language that is given. There's nothing about African Americans, nothing in the public presentation at the manor house or the plantation itself. And so I would just say that it was only by accident, having completed the tour and walking the grounds, the pathway, well tended, roped off toward the graves, and then turning back and seeing, well, because it's the Piedmont, of course you'll see fragments of weathered rock here and there. I mean, geologists, I look for rocks. And so I saw a rock. I thought, oh, that's neat. But then there was a pattern. And if you look carefully, you could see the rocks extending out of sight. There were about 150 or so there, with no words given. So the disruption of that presence, or seeing them, was just showing the lie of the plantation story, the story that essentially maintained the ownership of the owners. 200 years later, they defined themselves what would be told, and that story was still being told centuries after their death. And so writing it was the disruption. Because if you look at the South Carolina elementary school standards, the visit to Walnut Grove Plantation is still there. And it still lists, let's say, history without its essence at all.
Well, thank you. So my question about the second part of your talk connects with what you just said about being a geologist. You're a geologist and you're also a historian. You're able to bring these different disciplines together and the questions you ask and the ways in which you go about studying your subject matter. And when you spoke with us about the Chesapeake, you started in, I'm just going to call it deep time. I'm not a geologist. I don't really know when any of this took place. But you started a very, very long time ago. And you told us what was happening in the earth and with the earth, and you described those changes as transformations and conflicts, and then you moved into the human history using similar language. I wonder if you could share with us, as a writer, what you intend to produce in us, or what you hope that we will connect with or respond to when we hear you talk about Earth history and human history in a parallel or interconnected way.
I think there are different ways to answer it, and please don't take this is not a glib or flippant way, the first response, but I think that I'm trying to navigate that and trying to present the places and the times in ways in such that geologic history is not separate from human history, that they're part of the same thing. The Latin phrase, in media res, in the middle of things. Even when Pangaea formed, there was so much that occurred before. Even though slavery supposedly ended by law in 1865, supposedly, there still were forms of, let's say, extra-legal enslavement that continued. Even though racism existed in a particular form, a particular way, because race was understood in different ways in the 15th century, it's very different from how it was understood in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and certainly very different from how it's understood now. It's recognizing that it's not a single moment and then that's a starting place, but we're all part of a continuum. And it's recognizing how we can look back in some ways, and in looking back, help us see what might be ahead in some ways, but also help recognize and understand and live responsibly in the present. And that's not really answering your question, is it?
Well, in some ways, but I think you said you had two thoughts.
Okay. I think the other is because I'm in the midst of writing right now, and and as you know, and all of you here who write, in some ways, I'm not the one who's guiding the writing. The writing is guiding me. And so it's a process that I'm entering into, and I'm honestly not sure what the outcome will be. No, I'm not sure yet.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So now we'd like to open it up for your thoughts, comments, questions. And I'm going to try not to be too rude as I indicate that whoever has their hand up is the person that should be speaking next. So if you have a comment, a thought, a question, please. Robin.
Thank you so much for this. My question has to do with the second project and how it relates to the first. Trace was such a beautiful book, and one of the things that made it extraordinary was the way that it crosses genres, which must have given bookstore owners fits in terms of where they were going to put it.
I could tell you, well, I'll let you finish, but if I could do a digression, I could tell you a little bit about the problem. It took years to find a publisher because of that.
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. But one of the things that for me was so powerful was the way that you wove memoir or pieces of memoir into the story. And you mentioned the ancestry with respect to the second project, but I was just curious whether memoir is also going to figure into the second project in some fashion. Obviously, the region in D.C. is already appears in Trace. And so I was just curious as to whether that's going to continue into this new project.
Less memoir about my life, my journeys, beyond the search itself and the reasons for the search and what I encounter. So I will be part of it as the narrator, but not in the way in Trace in which I write about my childhood and incidents, experiences of racism. If anything, it's a memoir of generations past. That's my hope. And of course, I am not in a position to give voice to those who lived before, but perhaps I can at least acknowledge, illuminate, reveal, show an array of fragments that then in a mosaic narrative can be read by readers in a way of putting together puzzle pieces, because I know I won't know that this goes here and that goes there and that goes there, but these are the pieces. This is one way to make sense of it. Perhaps there are others. Case in point, and I know, Robin, this may not be what you are asking for, but for one story or one familial line, it includes a woman who was taken on Woodes Rogers' sailing voyage. It was a privateering sailing voyage at the beginning of the 18th century. She lived in Guayaquil, what is now Peru, and she sailed around the world after the ships left there, went back to England in Queen Anne's reign, was there for years, and then for whatever reason was on board a vessel to Maryland. And this woman she was supposed to be there for indentured servitude for a time to pay her passage, but then she was supposed to be free. But the owner, who just happened to be the wealthiest man in Maryland, kept her enslaved. And she was never supposed to be enslaved. She was not African. And it was only her grandchildren who sued for freedom on the basis that their ancestor was unjustly enslaved. She died enslaved. And they won their freedom in Maryland at a time because hearsay was legal. It was allowed. But then a case of a later descendant reached the Supreme Court, and Chief Justice John Marshall ruled against this claimant and ruled that hearsay would be inadmissible by law. So, fragment, a woman, Peru, Guayaquil, a sailing voyage, Supreme Court, SCOTUS, hearsay, and all of this So there are pieces that I've been able to glean, and now how do I put them together in a way that doesn't make it sound like a novel, or maybe it should, but I don't know. But in this case, it's true, and what's most important to me is to honor the original Maria, who found her life turned upside down in ways she could never have imagined, having been enslaved for the rest of her life.
Thank you.
Paige.
Well, first, just thank you, both of you. Lauret, thank you for putting up with my persistence for the last 3 years. And Tiya, thank you for doing this during your sabbatical. Touching into a little bit of what was coming up in your answer to Robin's question, you talked a lot about history, about the archive, about these physical traces, about these verbal traces that we use to make sense of deep time, human time. But I'm wondering if you could share some thoughts or more thoughts about the role that imagining and imagination plays for you in the process of reading and writing into these landscapes and into these sediments that you're, digging around in.
I think imagination in some way is the clothing that I always wear with it, not in the sense that I try to take any element in directions that are not called for, but trying to imagine what is possible, but trying to also do it in a sense of, given that here we are in 2024, I cannot know what it was like to live in 1705 or 1865. Yet, perhaps there are ways to ask questions not only of the material, but of the land itself, what the land's textures were then and then. And I should say that if you haven't read Tiya's book, because the introduction and your appendix both consider imagination and the need for it, considering the writings of other people like Sadia Hartman and Marissa Fuentes, and I'll add Christina Sharp and others. But it's recognized that I don't have free rein. I can't run free with it. But it is something that I, without being able to even sense what it is, I try up here and here. And you'll have to see what the end product is whenever it comes out. Thank you.
Yes, over here.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question. Thank you so much first for this presentation. I have a question about the image that you showed that say the description of images was related to the white man working, or one of the images, the painting.
Which one? Oh, Latrobe, Benjamin Latrobe's?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and this idea that the description is just referring to the white person surveillance the work on the land. And I had the opportunity to work in a project in Brasilia where I'm from with the images of the construction of Brasilia. And the description of the images were basic the same. Mm-hmm. Is the engineer in the construction, and there was 15 workers together, but the description was the white engineer. And I wonder, like, maybe connection to this idea of imagination, how to connect with those persons that are not described on the images, and when you work with archives, and even understand the agency to shaping the land. If you can talk a little bit about this.
That's a great question, and thank you for it. In the case, for example, imagination, what you were asking, Paige, that Latrobe drew that, or it's a drawing watercolor on top, was in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and it's where ancestors lived. And so part of my imagination ran with, one of my ancestors could have been one of the women there, and one of my ancestors could have been the overseer there. And just trying to tease around that. But one thing about Latrobe and that piece, and I hope there may be people who know more about his real sense of things, because there was sarcasm and cynicism there, and it was doing his duty. It's like he could recognize who really was working versus who. And so I've wondered if the titling, the naming of that watercolor, had something more behind it than just a simple focus on this person, but really a dig at that person to focus on those who were not named. And some of his other works do that. And if anyone knows more about the paintings, the sketches, the drawings by Latrobe, I would welcome a conversation with you. But I think there is much more to what he was seeing, because he was traveling through the South. Well, at that point, the Chesapeake, the northern part of the South, but getting a sense of the truly, not only the violence there, but also the inconsistencies and the outright lies that were feeding a system. So with your work, I would like to know what you think, or what you thought of that image in Brasilia.
Actually, it was a collective work that calls, what would be the translation, would be re-ownership, something. Translation would be something like this, re-ownership of Brasilia. So the idea was led by Professor Ana Flavia from the Department of History. So basically was looking through the archives of the images of Brasilia, and then understand like how the Black communities shaped Brasilia or built Brasilia together with Lúcio Costa, Oscar Niemeyer, and all the big names. Mm-hmm. But there are also workers that move from every place on the country to shape Brasilia. And that was the point of the ownership of the city, not just one name, but a community that came together to work and like shape the city in different ways, culturally mostly.
And that is part of the narratives, or the seed for considering not only free people of color and enslaved people of color, but the ownership, the claimed agency that is not recognized in the archives, but yet did exist. So that's part of what I'm trying to do too. If you have a card or anything, I'd love to talk with you more later. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, over here.
Hello. I just would like to hear a little bit more about the imagination thing, because I am from Latin America, and my ancestral lines are kind of lost, especially because of the erasure of indigenous blood and African blood that was into our families. People would tend to hide where we're from. So like when you were talking about like thinking in my family, I was like, I cannot go further than my abuelos and abuelas. I don't know what happened after that. And the only thing that I know is like some of them came from farms, and like I can see the pictures and I definitely can see the indigenous features, but where they are from, which indigenous group they were from, it's totally lost, as also like our European ancestry. So it's very lost. So I am so like excited to hear a little bit more about the imagination exercise, because it's part of what I have tried to do myself. Even especially given the fact that I am from the capital,
and I try to be very respectful of not naming myself as an indigenous descendant, not because I don't recognize that I have it in me, but because I understand that unfortunately for the historical circumstances, I have not been part of indigenous groups. So I don't want to claim an identity that I know I would be taking from other people. But I am so excited to hear from you.
Thank you. And I was never told anything about ancestry at all. All I knew was that my father, with his blue eyes and golden hair, was a handsome man, an angry man, but I did not understand race until later on, and the categories that literally divided members of my own family. From one side, there were people who chose not to mess with this, and they became white. I don't claim indigenous identity, but I do claim ancestries, and it's trying to honor that. And what's irking is that I know the most about the European ancestry because it's written down. And I can go back to the 1500s, and okay, great. Yet it's the other lines lived then too. And literally, how do I reach back? Not so much to touch, but to just recognize that there's a connection there. And that's part of the work. And part of what I have found that really is in digging in the archives and using archival records that were developed to control, to list, to maim, to define, to own people, yet even within that, there are ways to look at it slantwise, there are ways to look behind it, to work with it subversively, and that's what I'm trying to do. And with the free people of color, that's where things get better, because at least they're counted in some ways. Granted, it's with censuses, but also with those quote-unquote free Negro registers, but they're counted. And they're not only just counted, they're described almost like cattle. But the descriptions there at least help me imagine Fenton Man, 23 years of age, tawny. I've spent a lot of time imagining who Fenton was. Yeah.
Right. I think that we're getting toward the end of our time. So maybe one last question. Gary?
Thank you. I'd like to thank you both, Tiya and Lauret. Your work is so deeply personal. I mean, to talk about your father in front of us is really striking. My main interest right now, though, is the elision of geological narratives and human narrative. And this is, I think, somewhat of a rare intersection. I think of Lorne Isley a little bit. There are others, and of course I think about the emergence of environmental history, and this is a fascination, and we are trying to give some focus to that in the school. The key for me was maybe a device, maybe it's a thesis, but your use of the term violent for geology.
Oh, yes.
And yeah, I mean, it's rupture and it's terror. But these are terms that describe human conditions also. So in a way, that's maybe the natural trend for you, knowing, the hot fire of, millions of years of continents burning and pushing apart. And this is a comment, not a question. I just think there is great beauty in taking those images, the way you describe them, and also now telling the truth about what people endured, what the earth endured, what people endured. And that is my big takeaway this evening. Thank you for that.
Gary, thank you. I mean, for me, it's recognizing geologic history and human history as part of a continuum, as interwoven, interthreaded. But it's also recognizing that geology can be considered a metaphor or used as a metaphor for human experience. The deposition, the erosion, the rupture, and using words that perhaps are more commonly understood in certain ways and then using it in a different way. It's like, oh, ooh, wait a minute. And I guess for me, that has always been my interest in geology. Not that I don't like science, I'm not saying that. No. But geology and history and writing and art and understanding one's sense of place in a multitude of ways. They all are the same piece together. And so that's what this writing is for me.
They're entangled.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Everyone, please join me in thanking Lauret for sharing her wonderful thoughts with us this evening. And thank you all. Thank you for being here, you all. It was wonderful to have you.